Hello guys and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be covering the case of Alton Coleman and Debra Brown, who were the killer couple that terrorized over 6 states in the United States over the course of just a couple of months. Literally, it was less than 3 months and they went to 6 states, leaving bodies everywhere they went. There was just a trail of bodies following them everywhere they went. They wouldn't leave without a body being found, and police were always just steps behind them. They always seemed to have like some way of evading capture. It was just a crazy case, and I want you guys to stick around to hear it for yourself because it will shock you just as much as it shocked me. Whew.
So Alton Coleman was born on the 6th of November 1955 in Waukegan, which is the largest city in Illinois in the United States, and his home life was pretty unsettling to say the least. His mother was a sex worker and she abandoned him at a very young age, leaving him in his grandmother's care. But his grandmother was not the best role model either. She was known in the neighborhood as the Voodoo Queen because of her somewhat unusual powers, and she would also perform certain rituals in Alton's presence. Some of these rituals included the slaying of animals. Apart from his grandmother being known as the Voodoo Queen, the home was also known as a place to go to for sex. So as you can imagine, the young Alton was exposed or probably saw a lot of sexual activities. He was exposed to extreme sexual activity and prostitution, and I think this probably traumatized them somehow, because no child should ever be exposed to such things. No child should ever see such things. Alton also had bedwetting problems, and he was teased by his peers for those problems. They'd call him pissy pants or pissy or anything along those lines. So as you can imagine, other kids didn't want to spend time with him because they also didn't want to be teased. So Alton really didn't have any friends. He dropped out of middle school, and that's when he became known to local police for committing petty crimes involving property damage and setting things alight. He was a teenager when he was first picked up by the police for breaking windows in his Waukegan housing project, but with time his crimes would escalate to more serious and violent crimes. In his neighborhood, he was known as a hustler during his teenage years. He sold drugs and just did everything to make ends meet, including pimp out certain girls. So he was basically sending girls out to sell their bodies, and then he would like take the money and give them their cut, basically. His family members also said that Alton was very slow to show emotion, and he was just a kid that kept to himself. Most of the time he was alone, and whenever something would happen, he would be slow to react. He was also known for his insatiable and dark sex drive, which he would satisfy with both men, women, and children. Apparently he deemed children to be pure, so he was more attracted to children than adults. He also paid no regard to the time or place. If he wanted to have sex with you, he would have sex with you regardless of where you are or what time it is. He was also reportedly a cross-dresser, and he had a desire for rough sex. At the time, I don't think people knew much about cross-dressing, so they found it weird that Alton was a cross-dresser. In 1973, Alton and an accomplice kidnapped, robbed, and raped an elderly woman, and she later refused to testify about the rape. Alton was subsequently charged with 2 years for the robbery charge. 3 months after his release, he was charged with another rape, but he was later acquitted for it. 4 years later, he was acquitted for another rape. I'm not sure who he had raped, but he was acquitted for rape. And a year later, he was arrested and charged for an attempted rape, but the case was later dismissed. In July of 1983, his sister went to the police and reported that Alton had tried to rape her 8-year-old daughter, but 3 weeks later she went back to the police and dropped the charge, claiming that it was just a misunderstanding. Alton had a way of convincing the jury that the police had arrested the wrong man and that he would never do any of the things that he was charged with, and it was also apparent that he would intimidate the people who had laid charges against him to drop the charges. He would intimidate them or I don't know, he would do something to get them to drop the charges. The same year that his sister laid charges against him was the same year that 28-year-old Alton Coleman met 21-year-old Debra Denise Brown at a bar in his Waukegan neighborhood, and the two sparked a relationship. Debra Denise Brown was born on the 11th of November 1962 as the fifth of 11 children. She came from a poor home, and her father also had mental problems and had a drinking problem. Whenever he was drunk, he would assault family members, including the children. So Debra basically experienced a lot of sexual and physical abuse growing up. She was borderline mentally retarded, suffered from head trauma, and was described as a dependent personality. When she was 12 years old, she moved to Waukegan and she struggled socially and academically. She had a very low IQ ranging from 59 to 74, and she had no friends. So she started using drugs. At first it was just occasionally, but it then escalated and it became an addiction. When she met Alton Coleman in 1983, she was engaged to another man, but soon after meeting Alton, she broke off the engagement and even left her family to move in with Alton and his grandmother. Alton was apparently very charismatic. He had a way of hooking people and making people feel safe around him. So that's probably what attracted Debra to him. But Alton also had access to gambling and drugs, and he was just overall exciting to Debra. So Debra fell in love with him really quickly. Debra was quiet, she was shy, she was socially awkward. She was never violent and she never had any trouble with the law. But that all changed when she met Alton Coleman. A lot of people said that Debra would do anything to please Alton. She would do anything that Alton wanted her to do, and she would even follow in his footsteps. So Alton was very known to local police officers, and as you can imagine, that was soon going to be Debra's life. So as I've mentioned earlier on, this couple went on a killing spree together. This killing spree started in May of 1984 and ended in July of 1984. So 6 states in just, I want to say 2 months, because it started at the end of May. So 6 states in 2 months. Many bodies were discovered, and it was known to the police that this was the work of Alton and Debra. The couple met their first known victim, Vernita Wheat, in May of 1984. So early in May, Alton befriended a woman called Vernita Wheat, who lived in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and was the mother of 9-year-old Vernita Wheat. He introduced himself as Robert Knight, and he said that he lived nearby. And over the course of a few weeks, he would visit Juanita and her children and develop some trust between the two of them. On the 29th of May, Alton took Juanita and her 9-year-old daughter Vernita to a local carnival. When they got back, Alton said that he had a belated Mother's Day gift for Juanita back at his place and asked if Vernita could go with him to help him carry the gift back. So Juanita was very hesitant at first because they hadn't went to Robert's place. But she quickly gave in to her daughter's excited pleas and she let her go with Alton, or Robert. As it approached midnight and they still hadn't returned, Juanita started growing a little bit more anxious. She didn't want to leave the house because she felt like if Vernita was to come back and find an empty house, she would be scared. But she was simply too worried to just stay at home and do nothing. So she went to the address that Robert Knight had gave to her, claiming that that's where he stayed. When she arrived, she realized that the building that Robert had claimed to live in was actually abandoned. She ran to a friend's home and together they called the police. Juanita told the police that she had met Robert while he was riding through the neighborhood on his bike and they became friends. The police did not have a Robert Knight on record, but they gave Juanita mugshots to go through and they told her to point at a picture of a man who looked like Robert Knight. After going through 2 books of photos, she finally pointed at a picture of a man that she was certain was Robert Knight, and of course this was Alton Coleman. So the investigators called the FBI seeking assistance on the case, as per usual in cases where children of tender years disappear under unusual circumstances. They obtained a search warrant for Alton Coleman's last known address, which was his grandmother's house in Waukegan, Illinois, which was just a few miles across state lines from Juanita's home. Debra Brown was the one who answered the door and identified herself as Alton Coleman's girlfriend. At first, she was a little reluctant when it came to answering questions about Alton's whereabouts, but eventually the police convinced her to talk. And she told them that Alton had been gone all night and he came back home alone at around 8 a.m. in the morning to change into a suit as he had a court appearance later on that morning. He had actually been charged with raping a 14-year-old girl at knife point, and the mother of this 14-year-old girl happened to be Alton's friend. Debra also said that Alton told her that he had done something really bad, but he didn't really tell her what it is that he had done. She was really cooperative and the police trusted her. The investigators also waited at the house while others went to surrounding areas looking for him, but Alton was nowhere to be found. So local police officers were familiar with Alton Coleman. They knew that he often took taxis and cabs because he didn't have a car, so that was his mode of transportation. So they went out to the streets and they questioned certain people, including cab drivers, and they also made a $5,000 offer to anyone who would come forward with any information on Alton Coleman. So the cab drivers agreed that they would let the police know if they saw Alton around. On the night of the 31st of May, a cab driver called the police and told them that he had just picked up Alton, and he gave them their location and they started following him. Alton was dropped off at his sister Terry's place and he spotted the police officers, so he took off and disappeared into the night. Earlier on that day, he had befriended a man called Robert Carpenter, and so he went to Robert's place to spend the night after running from the police. The following day, he borrowed Robert's car to go to the store and he never returned. The police were desperate to find leads, so they started saturating local media with details surrounding the little girl's abduction. Pictures of Vernita Wheat were published on newspapers and on television, and the news reporters were telling people to contact the police if they had seen the little girl or if they had any information about her whereabouts. One cab driver who saw Vernita's pictures on the news contacted the police, saying that he remembered picking up Alton and the little girl on the night of her disappearance. He had assumed that they were father and daughter, so he didn't really ask any questions. He just picked them up and drove them to their destination. He dropped them off at around midnight near a scrapyard in the industrial section of Waukegan. So investigators approached the night manager at the scrapyard, and he did tell them that he saw a little girl walking with a man on the night in question. He recalled that close to midnight they had walked hand in hand through the side gate. He couldn't really see the man's face, but he noticed that he had a rolling gait to his walk, and that was a feature that a lot of people who knew Alton did say that he had. He also identified the little girl as Vernita Wheat. So the sighting was enough to allow the FBI to issue out a federal warrant. They now knew that Alton Coleman had taken Vernita Wheat across state lines. The task force responded by conducting a massive search, but they still found nothing. So the police knew that Vernita was alive at midnight, and they knew that Alton was alone at 8 a.m. the next morning. So this meant that something must have happened to Vernita between midnight and 8 a.m. But unfortunately, that was just about all the information that they had about Vernita's abduction. On the night of June 19th, 3 weeks after Vernita's disappearance, investigators received a call from a man in Waukegan who was going through an abandoned building looking for scrap metal to sell. He said that he was going through the house looking for scrap metal, and when he got on the second floor, he found a little girl's body laying on the bathroom floor. Her body was found underneath a blanket, and it was wrapped in a man's brown corduroy jacket, and it was at an advanced stage of decomposition. Her hands, feet, and neck were bound using a TV cable. She was unidentifiable, but her clothes matched those described by Vernita Wheat, and carnival tickets were also found in the pockets of her trousers. So the police were convinced that they had found the body of 9-year-old Vernita Wheat. However, they had to wait for confirmation from the lab. The forensic team later confirmed that it was indeed the body of 9-year-old Vernita Wheat. The abandoned building was dusted for fingerprints, and Alton's fingerprint was found on a doorknob at the scene. And I also think it's important to mention that this building was only 4 blocks from Alton's grandmother's apartment, so he probably just got out of the building and walked back home at around 8 a.m. Investigators now had enough evidence to issue out another warrant for Alton Coleman, but this time for the murder of Vernita Wheat. In June of 1984, Alton, together with Debra, appeared in Gary, Indiana. On the 18th of June, they came across 7-year-old Tamika Turks and her 9-year-old aunt, Annie Hilliard, who were both walking home from the candy store. Debra and Alton approached the little girls and promised to give them some clothes if they would come with them. So the little girls agreed and they started walking with Alton and Debra towards the woods. Once in the woods, the couple took off Tamika's shirt and they tore it into little strips, which they then used to bind and gag her. When Tamika began crying, Debra held her mouth and nose while Alton started stomping on her chest. After carrying Tamika a short distance away, Annie was forced to perform oral sex on both Debra and Alton. During the assault, Tamika started making some noise and Debra walked over to finish her off while Alton raped Annie. Alton and Debra then choked her until she was unconscious and left the scene. Annie woke up several hours later and she instantly went into survival mode. She ran out of the woods and into the streets and she collapsed in the middle of the road in a suburb in Gary. One of the people living in the area spotted her and then called 911. The little girl was then taken to the hospital. Although she was alone and terrified, she provided the police with a lot of information. She told them that she had been abducted with her 7-year-old niece by a man and a woman. She also told the police everything that the couple did to both her and her 7-year-old niece. She also provided the police with a detailed description and also told them that the man kept on referring to the woman as Slim, which was apparently the nickname that Alton had gave to Debra. Up to this point, the police were only looking for Alton and had no clue that Debra was an active participant in the crimes, especially because she had been cooperative when they went to the apartment to question her. So they started asking questions in Waukegan, and people who were familiar with Debra told the police about her mental state. So the police now knew that Alton and Debra were in what was described as a master-slave relationship. Alton being the master and Debra being the slave, of course. Because of her vulnerability and her dependent personality, it was easy for Alton to use and control her. Just hours after Annie was taken to the hospital, Tamika Turks' body was found in the woods. She had been strangled using an elastic from a fitted bedsheet, and the same fabric was later found in the apartment shared by Alton and Debra. Her hands were tied using strips of her clothing, and her clothes had been shredded and scattered around the woods. Tamika's body was found on the 19th of June, which was also the same day that Vernita Wheat's body was discovered, and they were both discovered in 2 different states. The day after Tamika's body was found, Alton and Debra befriended 25-year-old Donna Williams in Gary. Her badly decomposed body was found 3 weeks later in Detroit. On the 28th of June, they entered the home of Mr. and Mrs. Palmer in Michigan. Mr. Palmer was handcuffed and then beaten while his wife was also attacked. Alton ripped their phone off the wall and then stole their money and car, and they took off in it. On the 5th of July 1984, they befriended a woman called Virginia Temple after meeting her at church. Virginia then invited them over to her place to have dinner and also to spend the night. As she was preparing dinner for all of them, Alton, Debra, and the children were watching TV. I guess a picture of Alton and Debra showed up on the news, and Alton either turned off the TV or changed the channel. He then realized that he needed to change his appearance or alter his appearance, so he asked Virginia if she could be kind enough to cut her hair, and Virginia was actually kind enough to do so. When Virginia fell out of communication with her family members, they became worried, and so they decided to go to her place to check on her and her children. When they arrived, they found her little children alone and terrified, and there was no sign of Virginia or her 9-year-old daughter Rochelle. So they called the police, and their bodies were found in a crawl space in the basement. 9-year-old Rochelle had been sexually assaulted and then strangled, while her mother was beaten and her mouth was stuffed with her baby's t-shirt. The same morning of Virginia and Rochelle's murders, they entered the home of Frank and Dorothy Davendeck in Toledo and then proceeded to bind the couple using cables. They then took their money and car and one of Dorothy's watches, which was later found underneath the body of another victim. The bodies just kept on increasing and the police were always just steps behind them. They seemed to always evade capture. The media was still covering the case and it was now known that Alton and Debra were behind the murders and were on a killing spree. Some people in Alton's old neighborhood started spreading rumors that Alton's grandmother had given him some powder and told him to keep it in his shoes, and that for as long as the powder was in his shoes, the police would not be able to catch him. People were also quite shocked that Debra, who was, you know, quiet and socially awkward, was also playing a role in these brutal murders. On the 11th of July, 15-year-old Tonnie Storey from Cincinnati was reported missing after she failed to make it back home from school. Her body was found 8 days later in an abandoned building, and a bracelet belonging to Virginia Temple was found underneath her body. A fingerprint belonging to Alton Coleman was found on the bracelet, and one of Tonnie's classmates also testified to seeing Tonnie speaking to Alton on the day of her disappearance. 2 days later, on the 13th of July, they entered the home of Harry and Marlene Walters in Norwood, Ohio, under the pretense that they were there to inquire about a camper that Harry had put up for sale. Their daughter, Sherry Walters, was still home when Alton and Debra arrived, but she left for work soon after their arrival. Marlene offered them a glass of lemonade and they all sat down while Marlene went to the kitchen. Harry was sat on the couch as he and Alton discussed the details of the sale. Alton picked up a wooden candlestick and after admiring it for a couple of minutes, he hit Harry with it on the back of the head with so much force that it actually pushed a chunk of bone against his brain. Marlene obviously heard the commotion and she came out of the kitchen, and so the couple shifted their attention from Harry over to Marlene. Sherry Walters came back home from work at around 3:45 p.m. and she found both her parents at the bottom of the basement stairs. Both had ligatures around their necks and electrical cords tied around their bare feet. Marlene's hands had been bound behind her back while Harry's hands were handcuffed. She had been struck to the head approximately 20 to 25 times and her head was covered with a bloody sheet. The back of her skull was smashed to pieces and parts of her skull and brain were actually missing. Marlene Walters was unfortunately dead, but thankfully Harry Walters survived the attack. The living room, hallway and basement were all splattered with blood, and there were fragments of a broken soda bottle with Alton's fingerprints found in the living room where the attack began. Bloody footprints made by two different pairs of shoes were found in the basement. Their red Plymouth Reliant was stolen together with some money, jewelry and shoes, and the Plymouth was actually found 2 days later abandoned in Kentucky. On the 17th of July, Alton Coleman became the 388th fugitive listed by the FBI on the 10 most wanted list. Shortly thereafter, an exception was made and Debra Brown was added as the 11th person on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. I didn't know when to mention this, but the police and the FBI did predict that Alton and Debra would make their way back home eventually, maybe to regroup or to get some more powder, I guess. Then on the 20th of July in Evanston, Illinois, someone from Alton's old neighborhood was parked at a red light when he saw Alton and Debra crossing the road right in front of his car. He immediately called the police and told them what he saw, where he saw it, and what they were wearing. So the police made their way to Mason's Park where the fugitives were heading to arrest them. When they got there, Alton and Debra were actually wearing different shirts and caps to the ones described by the tip-off, which was weird. Alton also had a different haircut and no identification, so he was trying to convince the police that he wasn't Alton Coleman and that they were about to arrest the wrong man. 2 other police officers also stopped Debra Brown as she was trying to make her way out of the park, and she also tried to deny that she was Debra Brown, but the police did search him and found an unlicensed firearm in her purse, so she was arrested because of that. Alton was also arrested and the 2 of them were taken to the police station in Evanston. At the police station, Alton Coleman was searched. They conducted a strip search and a steak knife was found in his socks. They also had a plastic bag that had a lot of different t-shirts and caps, and it was later found out that they would stop every 3 to 4 blocks and would change their t-shirts and caps. A week after their arrest, over 50 law enforcement officials from Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Kentucky, Ohio, and Michigan all met up to discuss the strategy of how to prosecute Alton Coleman and Debra Brown. Michigan, which didn't have the death penalty, was quickly ruled out as a place to begin, and eventually Ohio was given the first shot. Alton continued defending himself and pleading innocent, and he also wanted to be given the chance to talk to the jurors because he believed that he could convince them that he was the wrong person, the police had arrested the wrong person, and he could never do that. Because if you remember earlier on, I did say that Alton had a tendency of convincing the jury that he would never do such things and that the police had arrested the wrong person. So he felt like he also had a shot this time around. Because he kept on pleading innocent and denying his involvement, this actually forced 9-year-old Annie Hilliard to relive the events of that tragic day that her and her 7-year-old niece Tamika Turks were attacked by Alton and Debra Brown. She actually had to testify against them in court and come face to face with Alton Coleman and Debra Brown. When the attention shifted from Alton Coleman to Debra Brown, many people thought that she was going to throw Alton under the bus in an attempt to save herself, but they thought wrong. Debra actually stood by Alton and claimed that she was the one who did all those things and Alton had no part in it. She also sent the judge a note that read something like, "I hit the bitch and I enjoyed every minute of it." But of course the evidence suggested otherwise, and so despite Debra's attempts to save Alton, he was found guilty and received 4 death penalties. On the 26th of April 2002, Alton Coleman was executed by lethal injection in the death chamber at the state prison in Lucasville, Ohio. For his last meal, he ordered a well-done filet mignon smothered with onions, fried chicken breast, a salad with French dressing, sweet potato pie with whipped cream, French fries, collard greens, onion rings, cornbread, broccoli with melted cheese, and biscuits and gravy. He washed it all down with a cherry coke. Debra Brown also received the death sentence, but due to her mental capacity, her death sentence was later reduced to a life sentence in 1991. But she is still sitting on the death sentence for the murder of Tamika Turks in Indiana. So what do you think about this case? Do you think there's anything that's worse or more dangerous than a killing couple? Do you think a murderous partnership is not as dangerous as it seems? Maybe, I don't know. What is it that you think about this case? Let me know in the comment section down below. And that brings us to the end of today's case. If you found this video entertaining or informative, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and also leave your case suggestions in the comment section down below. And if you haven't already, please click on the subscribe button and turn on your post notifications so that you get notified each time I post a new upload. And with that being said, that's it from me to you. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.